So today we're continuing our look at the Sermon on the Plain. This is the second week of us looking at the Sermon on the Plain, and I want to quickly recap what Jesus said last week so that we're all on a level playing field. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I think I may have heard my son groan from here. The entire Sermon on the Plain is directed to Jesus' disciples. It tells them both how to be and what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. The first part of the sermon, the blessings and the woes, dealt with the assurances of God's blessings on the poor and God's judgment on the wealthy, specifically when their wealth keeps them from loving and caring for others as they should, or when they put their faith in their own wealth and power instead of in God. After illustrating the principle of divine reversal, Jesus focuses on this same principle in interpersonal relationships. It instructs us to love our enemies. Being a disciple means letting go of vengeance or retaliation. As people experiencing God's grace, we must extend the same grace to others. Just like last week, this is a hard message, but one that's imperative that we listen to. In fact, that's how Jesus starts out this part of the sermon. But I say to you who are listening. The sermon was for Jesus' disciples, the great crowd of his disciples that had gathered, who wanted to hear Jesus and his teachings, to learn from him. So why does he say, to you who are listening? Well, Jesus had just finished delivering the blessings and the woes. Some of his disciples would probably have been overjoyed after hearing that even if they aren't full and laughing now, they will be. Some of the disciples may have been sent reeling, worrying about the woes and how they could avoid the warning that they entailed. And then some may have been so put off by how radically different Jesus was asking them to view the world that they may have just tuned out and stopped listening. So Jesus refocuses the attention of those who are at risk of not giving his next words the proper attention because they are still focusing on his previous words, and gives the people who are starting to tune out one last chance to focus and listen. If the first part of the sermon hits hard, right off the bat, this part hits like a truck. Love your enemies. Whoa, hold up, Jesus. I know you just said to listen, but I must have misheard you. You should have said we should do what to our enemies? That can't be right. But that is what this section of the sermon is in regards to. How to deal with our enemies. Who we should love, how we should love them, and why. These are questions that we all grapple with. Just to make sure that no one could think that they may have just misheard him, Jesus repeats the same principle in 3 more variations. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. The repetition is to make a point, to love those who you would normally feel anything but love towards. Someone who you would consider your enemy, you should still show them love. Someone who hates you, you should still show them love. Someone who curses you, you should still show them love. And perhaps the hardest, someone who mistreats you, you should still show them love. Before we keep going, I do need to pause for a moment and make sure that it's clear that in no way should we take Jesus' words as encouraging us to put ourselves in, stay in, submit to, or tolerate any sort of abusive situation. If you ever find yourself the victim of abuse in any form, please seek help and seek to remove yourself safely from that situation if at all possible. Similarly, as Christians, if we ever find ourselves witnessing any form of abuse, it is our responsibility to speak up and speak out. Every situation is going to be different and will need to be handled differently, but we should never stand idly by and tolerate abuse. And Jesus isn't saying that we should just take the mistreatment. Jesus is telling us how we should respond to those people and where our reaction should come from. Instead of reacting in kind, instead of hating back at, throwing curses right back at, or perpetuating mistreatment back at someone who we've allowed to view as our enemy, we should turn it around and respond from a place of love. Don't carry the hate with you. Leave behind the inclination to return the hurt that how you have been hurt. Hanging on to it doesn't help with healing. It doesn't make right what's been a horrible wrong. Let it go and love. Pray for God's healing and God's love to transform the abuser. Pray that God's love can do what your love may be incapable of at the moment. Pray that God will step in and love your enemy. Then Jesus gives us 4 practical examples of doing just that. First, turn the other cheek. In addition to it being a somewhat violent action, striking someone on the cheek was also very insulting. It was basically the physical form of cursing or reviling someone. Instead of responding in kind with more violence or violent words, Jesus says to offer a form of non-retaliation that breaks the cycle of violence. The last 3 are all very similar. Do not withhold your shirt. Jesus could be talking about thievery when someone takes away your coat, but given the context and the attention to loving your enemies and how we should respond to them, it's more likely he's referring to when one person would take someone's cloak or coat as repayment of a debt or in a legal action. Give to anyone who asks of you. Similar to the last example, this probably isn't just referring to our responsibility to give and care for the poor and the destitute. More likely, this is in regards to willingly complying to the results of one who is more powerful. And do not ask for it back again. If something is taken from you, instead of retaliating and trying to get it back, let it go. All of these lead up to what is commonly known as the Golden Rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. The Golden Rule sums up all of the preceding statements and the principles of loving one's enemy. This was a very contrary to the retributive idea of justice that was prevalent at the time, the idea of an eye for an eye, that for any harm done, there should be an equal amount of retribution done as well. Now, several different people have said some variation of this in several slightly different ways, but the end result of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is everyone being blind and toothless. Jesus called his disciples not to let selfishness or ill will determine their response, to mistreatment and to offer a very different path. It doesn't promote pure passivity. It's not just saying that we should take it when we're faced with hatred, cursing, or mistreatment. The very words "do to others" encourages action, doing something. By treating others, especially those that treat us poorly, with the love that Jesus encourages, how we ourselves would like to be treated, we are demonstrating that their anger, abuse, or violence can't incite us into reacting in kind. That the evils that we despise can indeed be resisted, and in doing so may prompt others to resist them as well. Now, most of you know that I previously worked as a debt collector. In general, debt collectors are not well liked. I would be insulted, called names, even threatened on a daily basis. I could have been curt or rude. I could have simply ended the call and continued collection efforts when they began getting hostile, as many of the other collectors would do. But I could understand where the other collectors were coming from. No one likes the abuse that they were getting, and no one wanted to be put through that. And I will admit that there were a few times that I did let people get under my skin and didn't respond as Jesus calls us to. But I also could understand why the people that we were talking to were so upset. No one wants to be in collections, and since it was mostly medical debt, many of the people didn't even have much control over them being in collections. One of the main things that got me promoted to a supervisor there was how good I was at handling upset or escalated calls. The company liked to say that I was killing them with kindness, but really, I was just trying to treat them how I would want to be treated if I were to find myself in that position. I was viewing them as people with problems and challenges, not just as some jerk yelling at me on the phone who I needed to try to get money from. I tried to make sure that they knew that I heard what they were saying and that I understood and sympathized with them. I would clarify with them to make sure that I fully understood the problem, and then I would try to make it clear that I wanted to help and that I would do everything that was within my power to try to help. Sometimes all I needed was a few pieces of information and we could get the bill reprocessed and covered. And once I was able to get them calmed down enough, I was able to get that and we could help. Sometimes it involved working out payments that would still get the bill paid, but that they could actually afford. Unfortunately, there were times where there wasn't anything I could do to help them. But even in those circumstances, most people could hear the empathy and the sorrow for them in my voice as I apologized and told them that there was nothing more I could do. I may not have always succeeded, but I tried to approach every call, no matter how angry or abusive, from a place of at least kindness, if not love. Instead of perpetuating the cycle of anger, I broke it. And more often than not, when I responded with kindness, their anger melted away, and we were able to treat each other at least civilly. Now, it can be easy to misunderstand the Golden Rule as purely reciprocal. We treat others the way that we would want to be treated in hopes that others will do the same to us. And while we should always hope that our acts and our kindness and love might inspire others and encourage them to act that way as well, we shouldn't treat others well simply because we think doing so will get them to treat us well. Whether we are treated well or poorly, we should always act out of love. In fact, it's arguably even more important to meet hatred with love than love with love, as Jesus' next point drives home. Conventional wisdom would dictate that we should do good to our friends and do harm to our enemies. But Jesus says that isn't enough. Jesus asks 3 questions, all in the same format. If you love, if you do good, if you lend to those who love, do good, and lend to you, what credit is that to you? And the answer to each one of these questions is, for even sinners do the same. It's easy to show love to someone who is showing you love as well, or do good to someone who has helped you and done good for you. The idea of quid pro quo is something that even the most vile and evil understand and practice. The idea of doing something for nothing, even if there is no reciprocation, that, however, is a foreign idea to sinners. One thing that I learned when I was researching and preparing for today's sermon is that the word translated here as credit also means grace. When Jesus asks, "What credit is that to you?" it can also read more of, "What grace are you showing?" If you instead do as Jesus commands and love your enemy, do good and lend expecting nothing in return, that is truly showing grace. That is giving grace that is neither deserved or earned, but is being given because of the love that you feel. That is the type of grace that God gives to all of us. That is why Jesus says that if we behave in that manner, we will be children of the Most High. Our relationship to God should be similar to a child to their parent. Especially when children are younger, they usually look up to their parents and try to emulate or imitate them. I would be willing to bet that almost every one of you at some point dressed up in your parents' clothes. God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked because of God's mercy and love for every one of us. And we should be kind and show mercy and love to all, just as God does. To be unforgiven and unforgiving can imprison us by the lack of forgiveness, but we should give and forgive because we have been given and forgiven so much by God. God wants even the ungrateful and the wicked to repent. The command to love one's enemy radically changes how we see and treat the world. It encourages us to love all people indiscriminately, just as God's love is indiscriminate. Jesus takes these principles of loving one's enemy and builds on it, calling people to forgive rather than condemn. He also promises that you will not be judged, you will not be condemned, you will be forgiven and it will be given to you if you are doing the same. There are two things I want to make sure that we don't misunderstand from these words. First, this doesn't mean that we should abandon our sense of right and wrong, or that we shouldn't encourage someone to walk with God. If someone is doing wrong, it doesn't just mean that we should allow them to continue unchecked. But we need to make sure that we aren't being hypocritical or self-righteous in the process. When it comes to matters of right and wrong, the best analogy I can think of is a parent disciplining their child. And even that isn't the best analogy since there is an unbalanced power dynamic, and I don't want to imply that, like the parent in the situation, we're more wise than the other person. However, when I did have to discipline my son, I never took any joy in it. Any discipline that I would give always came from a place of love. And as such, I tried to make sure that I never disciplined any more than was ever necessary. However, because I love my son, I also knew that I couldn't just not discipline him and let him do whatever he wanted. If I did that, it would lead to him hurting himself or others. Similarly, when someone is doing something that is wrong, we should strive to help them from a place of love. Because we love them, we can't just ignore what they are doing or allow it to continue, but we shouldn't be judgmental or condemning in the process. We need to come from that same place of love if someone is doing something that we don't agree with. There's a big difference between me talking behind someone's back and saying, "Did you see what John was doing? Can you believe it? I thought he was better than that. I never would have thought anyone from our church would do anything like that." And me actually talking to John directly, asking how he is doing, asking if something is going on or if there's anything I can do to help, and gently and politely expressing concern. The second thing that I want to make sure we don't misunderstand is forgiving. This goes back to my earlier warning at the beginning. Forgiving someone doesn't mean that what they did is okay. It doesn't mean that you should allow circumstances that are harmful for you to continue. It doesn't mean that you should allow yourself to be put back in situations that could be harmful to you, or not take precautions to protect yourself. When we forgive someone, we should be releasing the cycle of hate and violence. We are letting go of those negative emotions. That doesn't mean that we should just forget what happened, though. They still did whatever it was that we are forgiving them for. There are still repercussions for their actions. The Bible is full of stories of people who have messed up, made mistakes, even done evil, that were forgiven by God. But even when God forgave them, the actions they had done still had consequences, and they had to face those. The reading and this section of Jesus' sermon ends with an analogy taken from the marketplace imagery of measuring grains. It compares God's mercy, generosity, and grace to someone receiving their measure of grain. A good measure is provided abundantly by God. It's pressed down inside the container and shaken together to create more room until it's running over. This vividly illustrates the rich blessings that God will bestow on those who are generous towards others. Both last week and this week's readings can pose significant challenges to us as Christians today. Our media and culture will often constantly bombard us with reaffirmations that privilege is based on wealth and that conflict requires vengeful retaliation. Jesus' message directly contradicts this. It requires a dramatic realignment in priorities and the way that we think. If we want to be disciples of Jesus, that is what we need to do. We need to release our trust in wealth and power and release our hold on anger and hate. Instead, we need to trust in God, God's grace and mercy, and hold tight to kindness and love. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." So let us always be a shining light and a beacon of love for all. Amen.